Heading to the SNP spokesperson, Dr. Philippa Whitford, with some extra time. Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I too welcome the positive outcome of the recovery trial showing the contribution of dexamethasone, a drug which is cheap and accessible across the world. However, despite claiming to be well prepared for this epidemic, the Secretary of State has struggled to provide sufficient PPE to NHS staff in England. He has now awarded £350 million of PPE contracts, but can he explain why 108 million of that was awarded without being advertised to Crisp Websites Limited, which trades as Pest Fix, a small pest extermination company? Why was such a large contract awarded to a company with no expertise in trading or supplying any PPE, let alone highly specialised equipment for NHS staff? And how does the government think such a small company with only £18,000 of registered assets can manage the cash flow required to procure £108 million of PPE? Is this not just a reprise of the seaborne freight scandal, the ferry company with no ships?
No, Mr. Speaker. We have enhanced, under the leadership of Lord Dighton, the supplies of PPE across the whole United Kingdom. I work very closely with the SNP government on this matter, and we've made sure that PPE is now available in large part across the whole NHS and social care and all those others who need it. Demand for PPE rose exponentially in this crisis across the world, and it was difficult for a time, Mr. Speaker. There's no point denying that, but we have made huge strides in ensuring that we now have long-term contracts in place, and I'm really glad that the supply and distribution of PPE is much wider.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate the...
So I just want to read from this article, which is related to what was said in Parliament. Government faces lawsuit over £108 million PPE contract with pest control firm. The government is facing legal action after awarding an £108 million contract for a personal protective equipment PPE to a pest control company worth just over £19,000. The Good Law Project today filed legal proceedings against the government over its multi-million pound deal with Pest Fix, which has just 16 staff to provide equipment such as gowns and masks and face masks to the NHS. The government handed out more than £350 million worth of PPE contracts to private companies in March without a competitive tender process, as the UK scrambled to find sufficient levels of protective equipment for the NHS. So, I'll link this article in the description, but what's happening is that the government gave out contracts to companies that were not prepared to produce the quantities necessary for of PPE for the NHS. Now, was this done because out of incompetence, or was this done out of corruption? I don't know. I really don't know which it is, or I don't know which is actually worse. I'm falling on the side of corruption here, because I think this is part of a bigger plan to sell off the NHS, to prove to the public that private companies are able to fill the gap. When this disaster has passed, I'm guaranteeing you that the government will come out and say, we couldn't have done this without private companies. Now we're going to provide more contracts to private companies who are able to provide a better service than the NHS, able to deliver better products, better care, all of this as part of the propaganda campaign to sell off the NHS. Of course, they won't call it selling off the NHS. They'll talk about how it's a public-private partnership and how the NHS needs these private companies and how it works better with these private companies, and it will never be, of course, sold off, but of course it will. the propaganda will be always, we're not selling it off, while the reality is these are the first steps to the selling off of the NHS, getting private companies involved I don't know if there's been an exchange of money between these companies and and members of the government, but isn't it strange how there was no tender process? Now, on the other side, people will say, well, there wasn't time. But surely it doesn't take a lot of work to find a company that's capable of producing large quantities of PPE. There were companies that were willing to provide PPE to the government, to the NHS, but they were ignored. I covered those in other videos. So it is strange how a company with a turnout with a value of just £19,000 and 16 staff were given a contract worth over £100 million. Let me know in the comments, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks. Why not become a Patreon and enjoy access to our Discord server where we share news, chat, and have some fun? If you become a patron, you can also make video suggestions on topics that are important to you. Check it out via the link in the description.